right, everybody. So today's lecture is going to cover the American Revolution. Now, some of this is going to be background information, just to make sure we're on the same level and we all remember the same things from American history. Once we get a little bit later into the lecture, we'll get into more of the things that directly affect um, this course, have a direct connection. Some more African American participation and effects on the abolition movement that's coming out of the American Revolution. So, if some of this feels like you've seen it before, that's fine. Feel free to skip ahead, but you are going to be responsible to make sure you know this, as it's important to remember that African American history happens within a context of a greater American history, um, which in itself takes place in the context of a greater world history. So you do need to make sure that we place all of our discussions and all of our material within those contexts. Otherwise, it doesn't quite make sense. So, that being said, let's get started. Um, Before we get to the American Revolution, we have to understand, why did it happen? Why was there this rebellion? And it really starts because the British had been pretty much neglecting the colonies. They weren't really enforcing a lot of the rules. So the colonies were kind of developing off on their own. And to that end, eventually, the colonies butted up against the French colonies. And that's what really kicks off the French and Indian War, um, at least the American theater of it. This is known as the Seven Years' War in Europe. Um, we're just like a small portion of it. So the French and Indian War um, is our portion of the Seven Years' War, and it is immensely costly for the British. It's basically done to defend Americans from the French and from the French's Native American allies. Uh, it was started mainly because the Americans did expand into French territory, at least disputed territory, and it was widely seen as sort of sort of a reason that the American colonies needed to start chipping in. They needed to, start paying their way due to these incursions. Now, these start uh, drawing protests mainly because that the colonies didn't have representation um, in the parliament. Now, a lot of these taxes and things like that were actually modeled off of uh, previous taxes that were done on the Caribbean colonies. Jamaica had had a stamp act well before America did. Jamaica's was developed because of the because of slave rebellions that were immensely costly on the British Empire. But the British Empire basically came in and completely saved the colony. Whereas in the American colonies, uh, Americans contributed more militarily. So they saw themselves as part of it, whereas the um, people in the Caribbean, Jamaica specifically, saw the British military, as basically their saviors. That's sort of like a key difference here. So the protests that arise really they take many different forms: boycotts, street demonstrations, tarring and featherings, the Boston Tea Party, all things like that. That I'm sure you covered in your American history courses. Don't worry, you don't have to know anything really specific about any of those. Just know that they occurred. Now, one that does have a bit more of a connection is the Boston Massacre. So uh, essentially, people in Boston were upset because there was a large military presence in the city. Those military folks weren't necessarily always the best behaved, and the Bostonians, of course, did not were not the most welcoming to them. They were also competing with them for jobs and uh, things like that. So it was sort of like a powder keg ready to burst. And eventually, a street demonstration sort of bubbles over into a crowd throwing things and attacking a line of British soldiers. Um, the British soldiers end up firing on the crowd. Now, there's a bit of contention over what exactly happened. Many historians think that the first person to fire really just sort of slipped after they were hit with a rock or something, and then it was just a quick round of shooting before the officer was able to get them back under control. There were reports at the time of uh, people yelling "fire, fire, fire." In reality, that was the crowd. The crowd was urging the um, the soldiers to fire upon them. So when this occurs, um, why are we talking about this? Well, it becomes this huge propaganda for the colonies. If you really look at it, it's not really a massacre. Only 5 people die. It's really more of a mistake than anything else, a tragic mistake, but a mistake nonetheless, not a full massacre as you would assume. Um, and in this propaganda machine that comes up, you start getting images of neatly lined up British officers shooting and killing these men. The first one who was killed, reportedly, was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks. Now, he would have been considered at the time somebody of mixed heritage, uh, therefore classified specifically as an African American. Um, we don't know exactly his heritage. It's widely thought that he was probably um, Native American to some degree, and African American to some degree, and maybe some white to some degree. Um, we don't know whether or not for certain if he was an escaped slave or born free. That's another thing that's a little bit up for debate. But what we do know is that he was a worker on the docks who was there at the protests. Um, it's possible that he was one of the people agitating, throwing stuff, but it's also possible that he wasn't. There were witnesses that said both things. But what we do know is that he was killed, and most sources agree that he was the first person killed. Many people point to Crispus Attucks and say he was the first death of the American Revolution, and he becomes the symbol for the American Revolution, which becomes uh, extremely ironic that a person of color is the first person who dies, becomes the symbol of the revolution, which is fought for, as will become the popular phrasing, fought for the freedom of the American colonies. He becomes a symbol for freedom. And it's deeply ironic that a person of color is that. Um, and so he becomes this general symbol throughout time as sort of uh, a prideful point for the African American community, and as sort of a way of saying we were always there, uh, and uh, people refuse to acknowledge it, and people uh, don't always recognize their own ironies and their own hypocrisy when holding up one specific person as opposed to the more general idea that if we're using this person to symbolize freedom, then maybe we should make sure every person like him is also free. So soon after all of these things, war breaks out. It starts after um, a series of attempts to prevent war. It breaks out when the British try to seize a store of arms in in Lexington and Concord. Um, you have the famous battle, the famous shot heard around the world, the famous um, Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Uh, but what this really does is it sort of sets out the need to declare independence. It's sort of like the point of no return between the British and the colonies. And so in the Second Continental Congress, uh, the United States declares independence. They write this declaration. Thomas Jefferson, of course, writes it, and he formally breaks America from Britain. And in it, he takes these ideals of basic freedom and unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He takes these and he says, These belong to every man, every man. And that is going to be the founding of our nation, which is, of course, deeply ironic because he was a slaveholder. Um, Later on, you're going to be reading the first draft of this, and he actually does make reference to slavery. Um, and he tries to shift the blame of slavery to the British king. Now, the form of the Declaration of Independence really takes the form of a persuasive essay. If you remember from junior high English classes, so it starts with a dear king, you're okay, but like we don't really want to be with you anymore. Here's why. And then it lists out all of these things that the King of England supposedly did against the colonies. So it lists the reasons. And then at the end, it's like, because of all that stuff, we're independent. So that's the form. So when you read it, that's what you're looking for. So that basic setup. Now, the basic arguments for human freedom that are put forth and discussed and really become the founding uh, concepts for the United States um, are recognized as being deeply hypocritical for the United States. Um, and you start to have these stirrings of abolition. You had some people before who were anti-slavery, but this is where you start to get it more on a broader scale. You start having more organizations. It becomes a movement as opposed to individuals. Um, some of the most famous people are going to start coming out for abolition. Now, not all of these people were for abolition originally, but Thomas Paine, the guy um, who wrote Common Sense, arguing that it is common sense that America should be uh, independent from England. He also thought it was common sense that slaves should be free. Once again, banking on those ideals of basic human rights. Benjamin Franklin, he's one who uh, originally wasn't necessarily anti-slavery, but comes out for it later in his life around this time. And James Otis, who might not be as familiar to you today, but he was a very prominent statesman at the time, and he was very influential. Think of him as if probably along the same lines as a governor today or a prominent senator today. That would have been James Otis at the time. So the idea that you have a prominent person, a prominent politician like that coming out against slavery is extremely important for the sort of public awareness. Um, so once the fighting really breaks out, African Americans, of course, are joining. Um, we're going to first take a look at the African Americans that fought for the United States, and then we're going to take a look at the ones that fought for England. So some states did actively recruit African Americans. Now, there wasn't a very large free population at the time, but some free African Americans did fight for the American side. Others, for the most part, will let slave owners sign up their slaves. But they did need to provide some sort of incentive for those slaves to actually care about fighting. Um, are you really going to try that hard if, at the end of the day, you have to be returned to slavery? So a lot of the states promised freedom for slaves if they fought for a certain amount of time. Now, this wasn't necessarily carried out, and people didn't necessarily um, trust that this was going to happen. It's difficult for people to trust their enslavers, very understandably. So this was a little bit of a worry. In the end, African Americans made up about 25% of the U.S. Army. Um, Most of them are going to serve in integrated groups. There was only one segregated regiment, and this was out of, I believe, Virginia. But most are going to be integrated within militias or regiments. That was a fairly common placement for African Americans who were fighting in the American Revolution. Now, we don't know a whole lot about them. What we know about them is mainly from their applications for pensions. So when Revolutionary War veterans were able to apply for pensions from the government later on. Uh, African Americans were allowed to apply, and they did receive them in many cases. Um, Now, of course, they did meet a bit more resistance than most white people, but this is sort of our main source of knowledge about them, because they had to describe where they fought, who they fought under, and that gets us to the muster rolls, which we then can sort of piece through. Um, in terms of how they were treated in the American Army, that's something that you're going to be reading about in your primary sources that you're going to be taking a look at later on in this unit. But in general, we don't have a whole lot of information. Uh, it seems like basically what you would assume. In some cases, they got the justice they deserved. They were treated on par with their white, the people who they were serving along that were white. And in some cases, they received harsher treatment. It was a bit of a mixed bag. But to give a blanket statement that they were all treated poorly just isn't necessarily true. Now, for um, the British, certain generals early on promised freedom for any uh, African American or any escaped slave who helps. Certain generals do this, and it becomes a sort of rallying cry for many, and um, they will uh, trust the British a lot more, and a lot more African Americans will end up fighting for the British. Um, about 1,000 actually fight, and 20,000 are going to help in non-combat positions. Um, many more than the American side. Uh, Now, those 1,000 who fought and the 20,000 that help in non-combat positions, it's they. What we know about them is that they weren't necessarily treated the best. Many of them died of diseases and things like that. In many cases, they were put on the front lines to fight if they were a fighter because they were considered somewhat expendable. Um, but in the end, they trusted that they would get their freedom more. And importantly, they didn't have to wait for their owner's permission. If they joined the American side, they had to wait for their owner's permission to fight. The British, they didn't have to do that. So the hope of freedom definitely spurred a lot more people to go to the British side. Um, but as we all know, the British do end up losing, uh, and which jeopardizes a lot for those who joined the British side. Now, one important part about this is uh, sometimes you see people say that we might not have won the American Revolution if it wasn't for slavery. Um, Part of what they reference here is actually the idea that the escaped slaves going to the British side and being recruited for the British side actually spurred the South more to support the American Revolution. And that's absolutely true. We have documentary evidence that once the British started trying to recruit slaves, places like South Carolina and Georgia that were a bit more ambivalent about fighting for the American Revolution started seeing sentiment to help out increase because they were afraid that the British, if they were successful, would end slavery in the colonies, or that just they'd lose all their slaves um, throughout the war as their slaves would run away to the British side. So it's not that far um, of a leap to take that to think that the um, several of the southern states would not have been as enthusiastic as they were for independence had it not been for uh, their desire to protect slavery. Now, after the war, um, some, especially those who served with African Americans, do start calling for abolition. Those people who we talked about earlier uh, are going to be prominent, and they will start gathering forces, especially in the Quaker communities. Um, However, they will remain a small minority at this point. The southern states are going to be the most forceful about this, and they're going to, of course, refuse to end slavery. And they keep America's about 680,000 slaves at the time from knowing freedom.